everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie. Hi.
Hey, everybody. It's so great to see you.
Hi, Robert. It's good to see you.
It's good to see
Robert.
Am I in trouble? What's going on with this?
I was just looking at the mug that Diana is drinking out of, and it says Robert, because I accidentally put the wrong sugar in the wrong tea.
Oh, mine says Disneyland, which is not my name.
But it could be.
But you wish it was.
Yes. But this is not the podcast where we talk about various mugs and mug mishaps. This is a podcast.
It was.
No, unfortunately. Well, I'm sorry. I should not say unfortunately, but fortunately, it's a podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. And this week, I'm really, really excited. We're going a little bit off our typical topics. We're going to be talking all about TGIF. That's right. The great 90s ABC Friday lineup. We're going to be talking about... Hold on, I got to introduce this. We're going to be talking about Full House, Step by Step, Perfect Strangers, some Little Known Ones, Teen Angel. You Wish. I didn't even know that was a show. It's going to be great. What? Guys, I'm trying to introduce our topic, TGIF.
I think you got the wrong acronym.
Wait, what? Hey, everybody. It's me, Rob, here at ABA Inside Track. We're talking all about Pbis.
There it is.
Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports. Wow, that's pretty good topic, I suppose.
Don't you feel bad for the and?
I know, it just gets...
And never gets like a letter.
Does and ands don't get their own letters. So for those of you who are not either aware of Pbis or you've only heard the acronym a few times and maybe you felt not comfortable asking what the acronym means, it is a large kind of educational behavior intervention framework. It's a pretty wide-ranging topic, and one of the things that we've talked about doing Pbis for probably a couple months now, but I think one of the issues that comes up is, well, it's a huge topic, and even just researching the few articles we'll be discussing tonight showed us how much there was to talk about it. And also, there's a little bit of controversy in the field of behavior analysis as to whether Pbis is appropriately behavior analytic or just takes some of the findings from the behavior analysis literature and sort of shoves it into something that's a little less ABA. It doesn't follow our 7 dimensions, for example. Just like every week, we're going to take this topic. We're going to talk about a couple of research articles related to it. Now, big caveat, there are tons of books about Pbis. There are tons of articles about Pbis. So the fact that we picked 4 is by no means a symbol of how little there is about there to write. However, one of the things that we were looking for in choosing these articles were A, articles that would describe effectively what Pbis is, B, articles that were not just by some of the folks who have really been instrumental in much of the Pbis research.
That's smart, Rob. Why would you want to do that?
Well, certainly because if there's going to be a controversy in the field about whether Pbis is behavior analytic, and then we just pick the same, 2 guys who wrote all the research about it, or wrote much of the research about it, it's not going to give us a very balanced view of what's out there in terms of Pbis literature.
I like that. I also think that's a pro tip.
Right?
So if you're going to be looking at research, you want to look at research outside of the field or the lab that has originated that research.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
That was really good, Rob.
Thank you very much. And then I also, when looking at some articles, kind of stayed clear of the Journal of Positive Behavior Interventions, not because it's a bad journal or anything, but because, again, it was a lot of the same authors who were writing specifically about evidence of Pbis working in schools. So I looked at journals outside. So either journals that we typically talk about, so say Behavior Analyst, we looked at BAP, and also an article from Pediatrics. But you know what? We should probably say what articles we're discussing tonight, shall we? So tonight we will be discussing 4 articles. Somewhat in order, somewhat we're going to kind of put some of the information in them together in the discussion because, again, they do cover a lot of the same topics. The first is Applying Behavior Analysis to School Violence and Discipline Problems, Schoolwide Positive Behavior Support by Anderson and Kincaid from the Behavior Analyst 2005. Examining the Evidence Base for Schoolwide Positive Behavior Support by Horner, Sugai, and Anderson, Focus on Exceptional Children, 2010. And those 3 names are going to sound very familiar because they have done a lot of work on Pbis, or SWPBIS, as it is often referred. Then, Effects of School-Wide Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports on Child Behavior Problems by Bradshaw, Waasdorp, and Leaf, and that is in Pediatrics 2012. And finally, a reply to the commentaries on Schoolwide Pbis, an example of applied behavior analysis implemented at a scale of social importance by Horner and Sugai 2015. Pbis is function over form, the clear behavioral roots and opportunities that the Pbis frameworks presents to the field of behavior analysis moving forward. By Putnam and Noster from Behavior Analysis and Practice 2016.
So long.
That's not 4 different articles, folks. That's one.
I actually, when I first got this and I was like going out and I was like, all right. I like took just the first part and I like highlighted it and put it in my search bar. And then, because Rob picked these articles out. And then I was like, oh, that's a pleasant surprise that I only have one.
Yep, no, it's not 4. Just one.
Thought it was more than one.
Just one article. All right, so why don't we start off with a general review of what positive behavior interventions and supports are, a little bit are, a little bit is.
Yeah.
I think it's is.
I think that would be really helpful because, to be completely honest, I have not worked in a PBIS school. And I'm not really familiar with it. I mean, now I am, but before I read these articles, it was something I'd heard about and something that I knew that there was controversy around, but nothing that I devoted a lot of time to because it just wasn't part of my, everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm in the same boat. I always thought of this as watered down Kool-Aid ABA, to be honest with you.
ABA light, maybe.
And we can go through why or why not that might be the case. But our kids' school had these little stickers and they're you can be an owl star, and they're shaped like owls. And I was like, I think that's what PBIS is. Maybe. But beyond that, I really didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
So other folks might be in the same boat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or maybe they're already owl stars.
It certainly could be. And I certainly have worked in a lot of different school systems, and I don't think I've ever worked in a PBIS system. I know I saw a talk about it years ago, but that was sort of when I first even learned about the idea of the tiered interventions, which we've actually has come up in a lot of our recent episodes, the idea of multiple tiers of any sort of support or intervention, behavioral intervention for either students or clients, consumers. So
we talked through it in episode 95. Which was Preschool Life Skills Part 2.
Yep. So this will be more of that, but different. First, let me set the stage for all of you out there. So where did kind of this idea of a system of behavioral interventions at the school level, so kind of looking at the school as the organism in terms of behavior change? And a lot of this comes from many of the concerns raised by educators. So in the Anderson and Kincaid article, they start with sort of a review of some of the issues going on. So one of the positives, I think, in our modern schools is in terms of while the threat of real serious violence always feels very near because they are such big stories when there is a school shooting or there is school violence, the overall rate of drug use on campus and weapons on campus, those have gone down over the years. But what continues to be a problem and is actually listed in a Public Agenda 2004 survey of middle and high school teachers is disruptive behavior is actually the big concern that teachers have. I think 70% reported that was a serious concern to them. 85% of new teachers said, I don't actually know how I would respond to disruptive behavior. I can't manage it very well.
That makes me scared.
I'm just surprised.
Yeah.
That shifted a bit. I know a lot more education courses and master's programs have classes on behavior interventions now, whereas they might not have had those as of the 2004 survey.
Right. That makes me feel a little bit better. I almost wrote a little note to myself to be check the education department at the school that I work at.
I mean, I informally asked a few people the other day. I said, did you do that in your master's program? Teachers who just started in the field. It did seem more ubiquitous than it had been, at least, but not necessarily to a point that that you would say a teacher is a master of behavioral interventions necessarily. 77% of teachers in that same survey reported that they could educate better if discipline weren't a problem. And many also reported they spend more time managing disruptive behavior than actually teaching to a lot of students, which is always a sad thing, and you don't want to hear that in schools because we don't send our kids to school so that they can learn discipline procedures. We send them to school so they can be taught. And, for all of you who've probably ever been anywhere, as I think we've talked about, and it becomes the theme in a lot of our topics when we talk about large-scale implementation of behavior change procedures is most of the procedures in place right now are very reactive. They're very punitive. So, what happens if a student is disruptive? They go to the office and they get a report. Maybe they lose school privileges. Maybe they're suspended. Maybe they get detention. And there's this sense that, well, if the kids are punished, they'll learn what they did wrong and they won't do it anymore. It's a paraphrase of a quote from Colvin, Kaminui, and Sugai in a 1993 article that they'll engage in new behavior with this punishment. Like punishment is somehow motivating them to engage in new behavior, which of course we know by definition is not the case. Where does that leave us? Well, we've got a lot of students who are receiving reactive interventions. Many of these interventions may actually inadvertently reinforce the behavior that we're hoping to decrease. Why do many kids start goofing off in class? Because they don't want to do work or because they would like teacher attention. What do they get when they are getting yelled at by teachers or sent to the office and they have to have an hour-long talk with the principal? Escape from work and a lot of attention.
Right. So I like what a lot of, I think every one of the articles that we are reading this week talk about how PBIS is a veering away from the traditional classroom environment, right? Where that is what you did, right? It's more I'm using quotation marks, punishing, right? That it's more about topography and less about function. Mm-hmm. And PBIS, I would, if it's going to talk about being behavior analytic, right, then it must be function over topography. So I kind of liked that distinction because reading it, I was like, oh yeah, I can imagine a lot of teachers having a harder time with this, right? Because it's going directly against what we all know as school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
If you're not familiar with the idea of behavior being based in function,
right,
then it's just a totally foreign concept.
Yeah, right? Why would I ignore that? I want them to stop doing it, right?
Yeah. It never made sense to me that kids would get suspended from school as a punishment because very often that seemed as though it would be reinforcing.
Yeah. And again, a lot of these introductory findings were from a 2004 study. There are lots of schools, many schools, that have really shied away from the idea of sending the kid out of school to be punished as an effective treatment. Because again, even in educational research, not looking at PBIS, the punishment procedure of suspension or expulsion does not improve overall outlook for many of these students who then go on to, without a high school diploma, go on to earn less money, have, more probability of having, other issues that we, I think, as society would like to help them resolve rather than allow to continue to happen. Just like with anything, there's got to be a better way. And this is really where PBIS, or positive behavior interventions and supports, comes in. And much of the work that went into PBIS came from both behavior analysis and organizational behavior management, as well as the tiered model of healthcare, which again, we've talked about already occurring a lot in education, that idea of there are multiple levels of intervention, starting from the universal, moving down to the more targeted, and then moving down to the individual level of interventions. Usually the three-tiered model. So you're going to see PBIS written a lot of different ways, SW, PBS, or PBIS. The SW is for Schoolwide. We're just going to refer to it as PBIS. I think that seems to be the term that has stuck in the research. So that is how we will refer to it for the rest of the show. The gist of PBIS is the idea that it is important to define the rules and expectations in the settings we are in. There need to be specific consequences for rule following as well as for violations of rules. Behavior is learned through explicit teaching. Depending on the tier, that teaching gets more and more explicit. Looking at how can we take that tier model and what's known about working at the level of the organization to expand the capacity of the organism, in this case the school, to engage in all of these steps and then maintain support for their use over time through both ongoing professional development and training and data collection and analysis.
Spoiler. This seems like a huge undertaking.
Oh, I think one of the articles I was looking at saying, it was notes from a talk actually that I found in my big book that says, I think it's like Classroom Management is a book. I put all my research on classroom management, was that you have to have, it's going to take about 2 to 4 years before you really have everything in place, even just the universal level, that like tier 1 intervention system. I know a lot of the things we'll talk about are, before you even start, you need to have like 80% of the people you're going to ask to be part of this agree to do it and commit to a period of 4 years. So if you just sort of are like, I want to do it, I'll get everyone to support me, and they'll see how great it is, you are not going to succeed in using PBIS in a school system.
Yeah, so I think that's just something that we can bring up early and often, that this is not something that you can start off at your new school year hoping to make a change in that new school year, right? That
I mean, you can start the process, but you will not actually accomplish anything by yourself.
Right.
This is a school-wide, and last we checked,
effort.
there are multiple people who work at a school.
Yeah. So the article that I'm going to talk about, the Horner, Sugai, and Anderson, that's what they spend the first part of their article discussing, is what does it really mean to use the term educational practice, because that's kind of how this PBIS is couched. And it's basically, you need to break down and operationally define every component of what this is going to look like, right? So the practice itself, what are the actual procedures that you're going to be using? Those have to be operationally defined. The setting that you're going to be working in, that needs to be carefully defined. The target population needs to be explicitly defined. The qualifications for the people who are going to be implementing this, that has to be defined. The outcomes have to be defined. And then the background conceptual theory and mechanisms have to be defined. So they walk you through all of that. So like before you can even get started on this, you need to have all of that in place and have everyone in your school on board with understanding what that means and what it's going to mean for them.
So when we talk about PBIS, what we're really talking about is a framework. So it's a framework, so it's a series of supports within which there are lots of specific interventions that you may use. And Jackie, I know the article that you'll be discussing kind of talks about that as a potential limitation. Some people see that as a positive, that it's a framework and not just here are the explicit things you must do to be considered PBIS. So there's pros and cons to that. But really there's an overall goal to prevent the development of further problem behavior, to decrease whatever currently is occurring to cause discipline problems, and increase positive social behavior of all of the students. We've got our 3 tiers. We've got our tier 1 or universal level of support. That's mostly what we'll be talking about on this episode, because when we wanted to talk about all 3 tiers, we realized we don't have enough time, and we already have other episodes lined up for the next couple, so we'll have to come back and look at that targeted support level, tier 2. And then there's, of course, the individual support tier 3. We're not going to do an episode on tier 3 because guess what? As a behavior analyst, you have probably spent the majority of your career working on tier 3 individual interventions. So hooray! You've already got 1 out of 3 done. But again, the focus is this is something that will occur throughout all of the school. So it's not something that you're just using for special education or just using for the students with discipline problems or just using for the kids who are behaving really well. It is for everybody in the school. There are 7 features that are discussed in the Anderson and Kincaid article that are common. Because again, one of the key components of PBIS is that it is a framework, meaning that there isn't a treatment package that you have to use every single time. You know, you will use some reinforcement, you might use some punishment, but it's not specified exactly what that would look like for your setting. Again, that's a pro and that's also a con. So I'm going to go over those 7 features. The first is that it is a team-driven approach to develop and sustain systems change. So like we talked about, this includes everyone in the school. There's some sort of a central team that's typically kind of looking at the data and making some of the decisions related to PBIS that starts by kind of maintaining the commitment to some level of behavior change. Usually this team's about 3 to 7 people. It's going to include all sorts of educators, a behavior specialist. It definitely needs to include an administrator because unlike a lot of things that probably many of you out there have needed when you've set up an intervention as well, maybe you have someone helping you like a BCABA or an RBT helping collect data and implement. You have your consumer and the family, and that's kind of it. That's all you need. In this case, you're not going to be able to do all this by yourself. Even if you're the principal or the administrator, you can't do this all by yourself. You need a team of people.
I really loved the fact in, I think, multiple articles, they said that you need someone from every walk of life at the table, right, to be part of this when you're developing your plan. So administrators, teachers, special education team. One of my article, I think, talked about having a student, right? I think that would be important, too, to get buy-in. I like that idea, and maybe have 1 or 2 because you don't want one person to stand up for all.
Exactly.
Right?
Another piece, and I think you're all going to be very excited to hear this, PBIS does spend a lot of time talking about how there must be data systems in place, and that data must be analyzed regularly to identify where are the recurring discipline problems and where are the settings of those problems. We said this over and over. It's a framework. So this isn't like, here's what the classrooms will look like. Because you may be in a school where the teachers do have great stimulus control over the behavior of their students, and you don't have any problems in the classrooms. Your problem's in the hallways between classrooms, or in the parking lot, or the cafeteria, in which case your data will point to, this is where we need to spend most of our resources in terms of setting up expectations and rules. Over time, you collect more specific data with the tier 1 interventions, and you find, okay, what still isn't being done? What students aren't responding to this intervention? And that's where your tier 2s and tiers 3 interventions come in. Another piece that's important is the idea of setting up and developing expectations and rules, which I always kind of thought were the exact same thing, because they're not really defined behavior. I mean, rules are, rule-governed behavior is, but expectations is not really a behavior analytic term. So the way the articles that we looked at describe them are, expectations are very broad statements of expected behavior. We usually they're kind of the pseudo rules that we usually make fun of when we're doing these episodes. Be good to your fellow human and, work your hardest. Like, that's not a very good rule. That's very vague. It's not specific. But that's where the expectations come in. It's sort of umbrella terms that sort of define generally what is the tone you want to set in your school setting. Then you develop rules, which are really where the operationally defined behaviors come in. So in whatever setting you're in, what are the operationally defined behaviors that you'd like to see? There's usually not a lot of them, and they're set up to be phrased positively. What should you do rather than what you shouldn't do? Here's one from the article. Here's an example. Expectation, be safe. Okay, that's not much there. The rule would be, and this is for expectations in the hallway, walk on right side of hallway. Keep hands and feet to yourself. You can see the difference between the two, one being kind of broad and vague and one being much more specific. Another component of the PBIS, or a common component, is going to be having some sort of an incentive program to increase appropriate behavior. This is usually a school-wide system, and it can take a lot of forms. I don't think I saw too much specificity as to what these would look like, but they came back to... Oh, sorry.
They had a few, actually.
Yeah.
So one of them was, which I think would be horribly aversive in high school, is if anyone was engaging in the desired behavior, their teacher would put their name on a sheet, and then each morning an administrator would reach into a bag and grab out a name, and then over the loudspeaker tell everyone that one person did a good job doing X and X. I can see that working in elementary school but definitely not high school. That person is totally going to be bullied.
Yeah, and
that sounds like the worst.
Yeah, it does.
I can't remember where it was mentioned,
outcome.
but the idea that some of the results that you see in, say, elementary schools for PBIS are really strong. The ones in the middle school level and the high school level start getting a little bit weaker. Possibly because it gets harder and harder. The numbers get bigger. That's always a problem.
Yeah.
And then it gets harder. Squares, man.
It gets harder to compete with, I think, a lot of the reinforcement you might get from engaging in bad behavior.
Yeah, and I was actually thinking about, like, what would reinforce high schoolers' behavior. And I was thinking, just like much to the disappointment of everyone, time and money.
Yeah.
Right? So leaving school early, which you can't really do, and providing cash contingent on appropriate responding, right?
You could look at extra privileges too, like, hey, if you are above a certain whatever, or you don't, if you've accomplished whatever, then you get to go to the student lounge during free period.
If
you're below a certain level, you might not have. If you're below a certain level, you have to, during that free period, you got to go to a study hall. You can't walk around the campus quite as freely.
Sure, I love that you called it a campus.
We had campus.
Rob, your Ivy League background,
right?
They call schools campuses.
Mine was one building, and I think our lounge was in the basement next to the janitor's office because the janitor was lonely.
Oh.
We did not have a school lounge.
Yeah, ours was in the basement.
But they would call it campus lockdown when it was locked down.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay. There you go. See? I told you. Lottery systems were another example that I think we've talked about at some when we're talking about staff reinforcement. So you could certainly use a lottery system. Those are typically pretty good. And then calls to parents. And this, I've seen this, I think we've seen this with when we talked about supervision, the idea of, wouldn't it be nice if parents got a call from a teacher to say what a great job a child was doing, as opposed to, hi, I'm calling you. You know why. Your kid did something wrong or bad. Which is unfortunately usually when schools call. Another key kind of feature or common feature is having a continuum of consequences for rule violations. And this is less about here are specific consequences that work well in school-wide systems of support, and more just the idea that there are consistent rules and expectations. Therefore, you can have consistent responses when those expectations are not met, or when something that precludes the completion of the appropriate behavior is done. So when someone does something, quote unquote, wrong, you define the problem behavior and clearly discuss this is what will happen. And if you don't follow that rule and you do something other than that.
I think this is going to be the hard part for teachers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking, as we go through this is, I think, the part where when you look at IEPs are supposed to be written operationally,
Mm-hmm.
right? And a lot of the times they aren't.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, I'm not saying always though, right? But I've got you're doing great at math. You'll
Mm-hmm.
perform better at math and one test,
I think
right?
it's tough because I think
It's
like
tough.
most things that the government will do, it is all of a sudden y'all need to be using more data.
Right.
And everyone tries so hard.
But no one's
many of them were never
right. You're not trained on how to do that. So if there's not training on how to provide operational definitions
Yeah.
for things, I think that it's going to be really hard for school systems to operationally define respectfulness.
Yeah.
Right.
And what happens when it's you need to do this, or you're in trouble. Here's
Yeah.
an in-service where we give you some examples. Well, we all do the same thing. We take the examples and we try to iterate on that example as best we can, not always understanding why that is a good or bad example. And then it gets us into trouble where we rewrite something that looks like it's collecting data, but we don't actually understand what data we need to collect
Right.
or how we're going to measure it. But we know it looks like we're doing the job. So people say, this looks like a nice objective. And then when it comes time to report on it, we're like, I don't know what I'm supposed to report on because I don't understand how I wrote this because I did it so long ago.
Right.
I just did it because I didn't get in trouble. I don't understand what I want to do. No one's trying to do a bad job. It's just you need to be taught how to do these things. And that takes a lot more time than I think everyone is given.
Yeah, I agree with you too. And I think part of that initial training should be this is an example of what an operational definition is.
Yeah.
If you're going to do that behavioral skills training, maybe before even that behavioral skills training, give that training to people.
Exactly. And
Right.
ideally, these consequences that are specified and laid out have some data to back up a possible function. So even though they're probably not necessarily very function-based consequences, they're more likely to be function-based than not function-based, based on the fact that you've collected some data, you've thought about what are the common occurrences, where are they occurring, what other environmental variables are going on at the time. This other piece, and this is one that I know we love because, hey, we've talked about it on enough episodes, design and implementation of curriculum which will teach students, faculty, and staff expectations, rules, and rewards. Specifically, behavioral skills training or behavioral skills training-like procedures are mentioned as ones to be used, reviewing the expectations and rules, as well as with a rationale, which, again, you might include the students on this, some role play, describe the settings, examples and non-examples, which, again, that's not part of behavioral skills training, but you can use that.
Could be.
You could use that as part of behavior skills training. Opportunities to practice the behaviors that you should and should not engage in. And then the reinforcement of following the rules, the consequences, which are probably somewhat either punitive or some sort of extinction procedure when students do not follow those rules. And then feedback during rehearsals. I do love the idea that this is something that you'd start when you implement Pbis. You do a lot more training, and then you would do ongoing training as time went on. And you also include the teachers that are in the setting. So you're not just setting up rules like, hi, I'm the behavior guy. I've come here to teach you all the rules. And then I'm not going to tell your teachers because they didn't come to this event because they have something else they're supposed to be doing right now. So I hope you tell them or somebody tells them, but I'm leaving right now. So no one will know. The teachers actually do the teaching of these skills. So they are very clearly aware of what those expectations are. And then finally, again, another piece that I think we all love, there's an ongoing monitoring of school data to evaluate the efficacy and fidelity of the Pbis program overall. Now, kind of one of the controversies that comes up is the data that's collected in a lot of these Pbis systems specific enough? Is it objective? Is it subjective? A lot of what's used in the initial systems are ODRs, or office detention reports. So when a child is sent to the office because they're in so much trouble, that's usually when something gets written up. It is a teacher report in that regard, but it's not always written at the same time the student is sent to the office, so there's a delay between the behavior and what's reported. It might be something like student was insubordinate, so, again, these initial systems might not be specific.
There's a lot of potential for bias.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing that my article that suggested too is that because there's no operational definitions, you might see a wide variety of reasons why people are being referred to the office. So just putting something in place that specifies who and what, or for what behaviors people go to the office and definitions, may actually just reduce it rather than having a program in place, right? But I think you have to start somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Right? Part of the PBIS, the framework, includes that piece of that's probably where you're going to start. But you're going to use that data to determine where are the highest needs in the building. Therefore, where do we spend most of our training time setting up expectations and rules, doing our practice and our feedback, setting up whatever our reinforcement system is or our punishing consequence system is, if you choose to use that. And then over time, using that same data system that you've defined and redefined a little bit more to determine, is that affecting the change we want to see? If it's not, okay, what else can we add? Perhaps we need some tier 2 or tier 3 interventions. And then when you see a change, great, where else are there problems in our system? And then your data systems get better and better over time. But you're probably starting with those general ODR. But there's definitely a review of the data. That's where the team comes in. They're the ones who are looking at that data on a regular basis. And then you present that data regularly to show to other teachers to make sure they know that they're doing what they need to be doing, for the team to determine, are we making effective progress in our schools?
But it's also, it's a school-wide intervention, so you could have anywhere from 200 to 1,000 or more students that you're trying to collect data on every day. So there's going to be some give there with regard to how we can get a measurement.
It's not an easy process. And I think, like we mentioned at the top of the show, it is something that you need to get a huge amount of buy-in from teachers and staff. You need to have everyone devoting a period of time of about 2 to 4 years in which to implement and see any positive results from your PBIS system.
No problem. I have nothing else.
And yeah, it's just one more thing. We're not just working on behavior in schools. We're working on other teaching, social teaching, academic teaching. There's a lot going on. So it's one more thing. However, as we'll talk about in many of the other articles, and when we talk about the results, there are a number of schools in the United States that are implementing PBIS. So it's not something that's just a pipe dream or an idea somebody had and we wrote it out and said, wouldn't this be a good idea? This is actually being implemented in a number of school systems across the country.
What does pipe dream mean?
A pipe dream?
Yeah.
It's like it's pie in the sky, something that is probably never going to happen, but you want it to happen. But
is it like a pipe, like a Mario Brothers pipe, or like a smoking pipe?
Honestly, it makes me think of the computer game called Pipe Dream, in which you had a flow of water and you needed to put special pipes in the maze to make the water flow to the end, or else you lost the game. It was like a puzzle game.
I thought it was like you had to warp there to get it.
No, that's not a dream, though. You can go down those pipes all the time if you're Mario.
Okay.
It's part of being Mario, right?
Maybe it's like you're smoking a pipe and dreaming about. It's contemplative.
And all my research for this episode did not look up the etiology of pipe dream.
All right.
No, I like yours, though. That's a good one. You're dreaming while smoking your pipe. It's not very.
Or is it like you're seeing through a pipe? It's like way far away. I'm gonna look it up.
Maybe.
I'll get back to you after the break.
Okay. Speaking of which, I think we've talked a lot about sort of the general idea of what PBIS is. Let's talk about a few more specifics as well as results. Does PBIS improve school-wide behavior? I don't know. Well, I do, but you might not. We'll tell you when we get back. See you in a bit.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back talking all about PBIS, Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports. Why do I keep saying out the acronym? Because I'll be honest, even though I've read multiple articles about this now, it's still very hard for me to remember what the heck PBIS stands for. So I'm saying it over and over to really increase my fluency with the term.
So, Rob, pipe dream refers to the dreams that people had when they smoked opium.
Oh, so you weren't too far off with your...
Yeah.
So, okay, great.
I mostly have always thought about Mario, but now I'm switching it over.
Okay, so given the opioid epidemic in the country, this is not really an appropriate term to use anymore. I'll use a different one. Let's do pie in the sky.
Okay.
That's more fun. Before we continue our discussion of fun sayings and PBIS, I wanted to make sure that all of you listeners out there are aware that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to this podcast, you can earn yourself 1 continuing education credit. All you need to do is, well, listen to the episode and then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/get-CEUs. Now, you are going to need to know 2 secret code words that we've hidden throughout the episode. I'm going to uncover the first one for you right now. It is Starburst. 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 Like the candy that comes in many flavors. Or, you know, if a star exploded, you could refer to that as the scientific term supernova, or the more fun and image-filled term, starburst. Starburst. So let's continue on talking about PBIS. So, Diana, you will be taking the lead on a discussion of the Horner and Sugai article. Now, Horner and Sugai, if we really wanted to make this easy on ourselves, we could have just read a bunch of articles by Horner and Sugai because they've done a ton of writing on the subject of PBIS. They've written manuals about PBIS. They've done research related to PBIS. But of course, we didn't want to just give you all one voice. So this is really our only full Horner and Sugai article. And of course, Anderson as well was on this one as she was on the last one. But Horner and Sugai, that name came up a ton when I was, starting to look for original articles. So, Diana, tell us a little bit about some of what Horner and Sugai have to say, and Anderson, don't want to forget, about PBIS.
Sure. So and I apologize for my voice, first of all, but we've talked through a good amount, I think, of the background of what they talk about in this article, and it is another one where they're just sort of laying out the components of it. They talk about the evidence-based practice, but it's not an article that reviews in detail one specific example. So it's another kind of background painting piece, which is useful. Mm. And I already kind of gave you guys the rundown on their definition of what educational practice is. Because I found all of these articles interesting in that they are careful in the way that they describe PBIS, right? It's never supposed to be the idea they're like, oh, we're going to buy the PBIS package, right? Mm. And someone's going to come train us, and then our school will do PBIS as TM, It's supposed to be this framework within which you can operate and design and designate what's appropriate for your particular school system and the student population that you serve, right? Mm. And there's some additional points upcoming, I think, that speak to how one might modify that based on what's culturally relevant for your school. So I appreciated all of that, and they highlighted that again in the beginning of this episode. So first, they went through and just defined what educational practice was, and it's basically breaking down every component that one might need to include before embarking on an overhaul of your entire reinforcement system at a school. And just carefully defining everything, getting everyone on board. That was basically kind of the background piece there. Mm. There's some great information in here, but it's related to the Tier 2 interventions. It gives us some on that, but we're really focused on Tier 1 right now. So the piece that I mostly took from this, they had a really nice table that broke down the procedures and systems that are commonly seen in PBIS. And I thought that might be the easiest thing to kind of distill from this article to share. So that's what I was going to focus on. All right, so they talk about that there are procedures that are commonly seen, and those are really practices that are focused on students. And then they talk about that there are systems that are commonly used, and those are really practices that are focused on the faculty and staff.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, some of those double up with the sort of the 7 kind of pieces of the overall PBIS framework that we talked about, but I think they get into more sort of practical detail. It's a little more defined as to what that would look like.
Underneath the procedures section, so these are the things that are really focused on students. I'm just going to read them off to you as they were defined straight from the table.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one is school-wide implementation. So it's not, like you said, Rob, it's not specific to the special ed population or even specific students, but everyone who goes to school there is included within this intervention framework. In that same vein, there are behavioral expectations for the whole school that are defined and then taught. Everyone knows what those rules are. They've been objectively defined in what sounded like the most boring way. No offense to your walk on the right side of the hallway example, but...
Not my example, so...
Sorry, okay. But, you need a definition, right? Like, you can, cutesy it up, but at the core of it needs to have a solid definition there. There's going to be rewards, aka reinforcers, in place for appropriate behavior. And that could be, depending on the age group, right? Maybe there's a ticket system or a point system, or maybe there's opportunities for your classroom to earn something bigger. There's going to be a continuum of consequences for problem behavior, and this is just the flat system in place. And that's can be quite helpful because then across the school there's consistency between teachers, because you always hear those stories that, one teacher in this grade is the tough teacher, right? And she's much, much harder on kids than everyone else, and then everyone's kind of scared of her, etc. So this should help to alleviate some of those problems by having it consistent across all teachers in the school. There are school-wide classroom management strategies in place, again, so you don't have sort of rogue teachers who are doing their own thing. There's a whole system that everyone's adhering to. Family involvement practices, I think this is really important when we think about the value of social validity in our field as well as generalization. So everyone's contributing to the system and their concerns with it are being heard. And then finally, again, it's data-driven. So they're collecting data and they're using those data to make decisions regarding student progress or modifications that might need to be made or students that might need to bump up to a higher tier within the system.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those are sort of the student-oriented components of PBIS. And then the other side of it is how are you going to keep the faculty and staff on board, interested, engaged, and trained?
I think that's actually really important, right?
Uh-huh.
Because if they're not on board, even if one teacher, right, or one administrator drops the ball, I think it could have really bad effects.
Yeah, the administrator is really key. And
right?
I think one teacher might be okay, because even looking at what do you need? Well, to do PBIS, 80%. So if you got a couple teachers that are, poo-pooing the rules, well, your system will probably still go on, unless you only have 3 teachers in your whole school, in which case your 33% teacher help is not going to work.
How did you get that percentage?
You can't reach 80%. It's impossible.
Well, that one teacher's only 10% on board, I guess. 13% on board. All right, so on this faculty and staff side, it's a team-based implementation again, so everybody's on board basically. And then what you guys just mentioned is so key, administrative commitment. The administrator is the one who's really going to keep everything steered in the right direction. So that person needs to be committed to this and have it be a top priority for them. There should be clear policies that focus on social behavior for the students, right? So it's not a reactive system. It's intended to be proactive, and we're teaching positive pro-social behavior to the students. There's an annual staff orientation to PBIS, and there's always an influx of new staff. So if you planned this thing 4 years ago and trained those people and now finally is up and running, well, you could have a good percentage of turnover. So that's no good. So you got to keep annually training people and keep them jazzed about it.
Which is hard, right?
Yep.
Because you guys don't have a lot of time in school, public school. There's not a lot of time for training.
No, but there should be some professional development days, so this might be a focus for one of those early days in the school year. There's universal screening for behavior support, so everyone, it's not just the BCBA, like you were saying, Rob, who's going to be the only person who knows how this behavior system's going to work or determining who needs support. Everyone's going to get screening on that. Not only will data be collected on the student side, but also procedural integrity or treatment fidelity data as well on the teacher side. So ensuring that everyone knows what to do and that they're properly implementing the system once it's in place. And then finally, the district as a whole needs to be committed to the PBIS model in its implementation and can support teachers and provide resources, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So all that stuff is happening behind the scenes, but if you don't have that in place, then it's not going to run properly. So it's really important to think about that too.
Right. That's a lot to think about, right? When you're trying to embark on a school-wide intervention.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. One of the things before we get into more specific results of studies of PBIS in schools, I know, Dinah, you mentioned Tier 2 intervention, that the Focus on Exceptional Children article by Sugai, Horner, and Anderson did go into some good examples of Tier 2 interventions. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. I did want to very briefly give a little bit of a definition and a couple examples. And if people are interested, well, maybe at some point we'll do an episode on Tier 2 interventions. But if you just want to read more about them right now, there's an article by Anderson and Borgmeyer in Behavior Analysis and Practice. I want to say 2010. It's volume 3, page 33 to 45, because that's back before BAP started putting the years on their journal printouts. And I didn't put it.
Forgetting something.
I just read that for background. I didn't put it in my notes. But that has a great review of Tier 2 interventions and some of the issues around Tier 2 interventions, because as we'll talk about in our paper from Pediatrics on the results of studies related to outcome of PBIS usage, really when we talk about PBIS usage, we're kind of only talking about the Tier 1 universal level. I don't know of any studies, or at least I did not see any, that looked at a school that had a really robust Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 model. I think most schools have a pretty good Tier 3 model these days. If you're using PBIS, you might have a good Tier 1 model, hopefully, and then Tier 2 kind of gets left out. But really what it is the tier in which you have students who are not responding to the universal interventions. So maybe they're still engaging in some amount of disruptive behavior, but it's not harmful behavior usually. And then you're taking some of those groups and you're implementing a more targeted intervention for a group, though. It is not for any one individual. Small groups.
I like how they also suggested that it was for high-risk students as well, that may possibly fit at some point into the category of Tier 3, but they're being proactive and trying to teach those skills in the Tier 2 model, which I really appreciate, right?
Yeah.
Before you have to put someone in a more restrictive setting. Along that line, one of the articles suggested that when you're using PBIS and you're using the 3-tier model, it is also more proactive than reactive. So you may actually find less students in that more restrictive environment. Whereas I think it was your article, Rob, that you reviewed, talked about how the more students in the more restricted article may have actually led to more problem behavior, and more disciplinary actions led to more problem behavior. Right? I know you brought that up, but just here to hit it home that if we can be proactive and keep kids out of Tier 3, if possible, then you might, see more streamline in schools.
Yeah. So Tier 2 is really just an increased dosage. Some examples of Tier 2 interventions would be, say, like a social skills group, think time, first step to success, and then one that I've seen used a couple times, check in, check out. That one I know specifically has some research. I know there was an article, I forget the journal now, on using check in, check out with African American students as a behavioral intervention.
That one reminds me of my life. I've checked in, and then I've checked out.
Now it's time to check out.
Sounds like a library intervention.
So,
these are all cool, so folks should read the article.
Again, we might come back and do another episode on Tier 2 interventions someday. It's not as well documented, I think, the results and what is needed as, say, Tier 1 or certainly Tier 3. You could use some more focus, I think. But in any case, does PBIS do anything? Let's find out, shall we? So this is the results of the Bradshaw, Waasdorp, and Leaf Pediatrics article. This is a statistics article, which are not our favorites, but anytime you can use a randomized control trial, as much as that is not typically the type of study that we talk about in behavior analysis, it is the study that the majority of science does look for. So if you have an RCT, you talk about the RCT because that's going to get you the most buy-in from the populace at large.
That is true. And Pediatrics is a very well-known, widespread journal. So that's actually really cool.
Yeah.
That PBIS made it into that journal.
Yeah. So as of 2012, there were more than 16,000 schools that were reported using PBIS in America. Again, the focus is on the universal components. And I believe The number's gone up in some of the later articles. I think it went up like almost 20,000 perhaps. And there had been a previous randomized control trial before this article looking at students into schools using Pbis, and then schools or students on a 1-year wait list, in which there were significant improvements in the reports of school climate and achievement. There was a 4-year RCT as well, and that's the data that they're going to use in this article, that showed significant improvements in organizational health of school, in discipline data, and in the implementation of the class-based support. So the point of this study was to take that same data set from a 4-year study and test the hypothesis of children in schools with PBIS should have better teacher-rated emotional regulation. I love these terms. It's like they have the science, so they can't get a little bit more operationally defined, but it'll be okay. And pro-social behaviors, and then fewer concentration problems. And then I think the one that's most important to us, the idea of having less disruptive behavior and less students referred to the office or suspended. Which again, since that's sort of where a lot of the initial universal supports come into play as they're trying to decrease those office referrals, is an important measure in this case. We're looking at data from elementary schools. So there were 21 schools that were randomized to the intervention condition, 16 schools randomized to a comparison condition, in which they said, we won't do PBIS for the next 4 years. So, sucks if you got stuck in that school, I guess. Maybe. We'll see the results, I suppose. If you were in the PBIS group, they did a whole lot of training. And what's important to remember is this was all state and district-run training. This was not a group of researchers from a well-known school of education coming in and doing all these trainings. This was all done pretty much in-house. So the results are going to be, I think, more reflective of what is probably going to look like for the average school in America. Each of these PBIS schools had a 5 to 6 member leadership team. They all went to this 2-day summer training. And this was co-led by one of the Pbis developers. And that's really where the outside kind of influence of researchers ends. And then they go to a 2-day booster training every year of the study. They got monthly on-site support from a trained behavior support coach. This individual was just trained by the district or by the state. They would do annual assessments of PBIS by trained assessors who did not know which school they were in. I mean, they knew which school they were in. They just didn't know which condition they were in. I hope. And maybe it was both.
Then they're blindfolded.
A triple blind test. They had no idea where they were at the time. There is a tool that had been used previously. It's been validated and all that jazz. The Schoolwide evaluation tool.
Clever name.
What that really looks at is how much is PBIS being implemented in these schools. And the schools in which PBIS was specifically targeted for implementation had scores of 80% or higher. So they had pretty much what we consider a high procedural integrity. Whereas schools that were in the other group, the non-PBIS, never even got close. So they didn't just randomly stumble upon the PBIS framework and start using it. The study went from 2002 to 2007, or at least the data set is from 2002-2007. There were a lot of different measures. Most of them were teacher observation checklists. So there's the teacher observation of classroom adaptation checklist that was done by the primary classroom teacher for every single student in their class. They did this in the fall as a baseline, and they did this every single spring, which is a lot of students that they would have had to do these checklists for. This measured the level of aggressive and disruptive behaviors of students in the classroom. It measured concentration problems. It also measured pro-social behaviors like, did the student show empathy, and emotional regulation behaviors like, do they stop and calm down if they get angry or upset? These were all Likert scales. They also looked at questions related to, did the student have office disciplinary reports in this time? Were the students suspended in this time? So again, we had 5 data points throughout this study. Once at the very beginning in the fall, and then over the 4 years every single spring. Then, statistics! What you found was a very interesting sample. We had about half male, half female students. What I really thought was great about this, and I think speaks to possible better generality of the results, is that many of the students that were included were not just, white students, white middle-class students. There were a lot of students who were African American. There were a lot of students who received free and reduced price meals. And there was even a pretty high percentage, it was 12.9% of the students who were identified as receiving special education services. So this was a very robust group that they looked at. And what the results showed after all the statistics were said and done was that there was a significant positive intervention effect on disruptive behavior in the schools that were utilizing PBIS. The students scored lower for aggressive behavior and for disruptive behavior. Nothing really changed for concentration problems. PBS didn't seem to have any effect there. There was a significant effect found for the prosocial behaviors. The students who engaged in, say, empathy, was higher, statistically significantly higher for students who were in the Pbis condition. They were rated that way. Emotional regulation didn't seem to matter which group they were in. There was no real significant difference there. They also found, and I think this is similar to, say, research in EIBI, that the students who started PBIS when they were in kindergarten had better results when they used PBIS across the study in their prosocial behaviors and emotional regulation. So similar to EIBI, good behavior game, the earlier you set expectations and rules for students, it seems the better off the long-term results of that training when the children are young is.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems it's very consistent, right?
Mm-hmm.
You come into school and this is what's expected of you, right? So there's never that learning curve. There's more contact with reinforcement, less error history, more exposure.
Yeah. They never had to have a different history in that setting with regard to their behavior.
Overall, the students who were in the PBIS schools had a lot of improvements in many of these rating scales. They had a decrease in the number of office detention referrals in the PBIS schools. They didn't actually find a significant difference in suspension rate, though. Now, a couple reasons some of these results might be. Could be that PBIS is more effective at teaching appropriate behaviors and maintaining low rates of problem behaviors than not using PBIS. Certainly, when we're talking about ODR, we did talk about the idea that those definitions might not have been very good to start and gotten better over time. Or perhaps there was some reactivity in the data collection. So these are certainly things that I would want to look at in the future.
Did they take separate data on actual, like, ODR slips, or was it just the teacher's recollection of who they had sent?
I believe it was just who they'd sent. It was just the teacher report.
So there's some potential for misremembering there, too.
Mm-hmm. There also was the idea, why wasn't suspension any lower, statistically lower in the PBIS school? And this might be the fact that these were schools that were really focused on that tier 1 universal intervention. And it may be that students who end up being suspended are students who just were not going to get maximal benefit from the universal interventions. Perhaps they were students who may need tier 2 interventions.
Totally.
So, and that would make sense because, we usually don't think of the kids getting suspended as, kids who engage in the occasional problem behavior. They're usually students who either have a longer history of engaging in problem behavior. Maybe they have a more difficult time. They have some underdeveloped social skills. A lot of things that could go into, what treatments would be needed to affect significant change for some of those, for students who might end up being suspended. Perhaps. When we look at these results, since we don't have a common measurement of ODRs was a limitation, we don't know about the suspensions. We're not 100% sure why the kindergarten students seem to do better, though. I mean, we can hypothesize a couple of reasons. Overall, we had a really good set of results supporting that PBIS does seem to improve a lot of the things it purports to in terms of student behavior and overall climate than not using PBIS, just sort of business as usual in the schools. And another positive being these results did come from schools that were doing this all on their own. This was not a university study where we had tons of experts who were doing all the work. This was the people day in, day out working with the students and making the decisions. Very positive. So when it comes to that, I wonder, why would there be any controversy about PBIS in our field? Wouldn't this be something that we'd be excited about? It's got the word behavior in it. Behavior support. Shouldn't we all be, so excited because we're finally seeing some idea that, hey, guess what? Analysis of behavior is important. It's a mainstream need, not just something that a bunch of crazy people with their Skinner boxes and rats are talking about, right? But, Jackie, as you are now going to talk about, there has been some controversy about PBIS and behavior analysis.
Yeah, so there has been some controversy, and the article that I am focusing on talks about commentaries on the article by Horner and Schoolwide, 2015.
I'd ask you to reread the title, but I think we'll run out of time if you do.
I think so. So the main purpose here was just to talk about the different commentaries related to PBS and how some of these authors may feel that PBIS may have some limitations and where this controversy might come from. However, when I read this, and I think this is important to note, is that it felt one-sided.
Mhm.
So when I'm reading this article, the authors write, here's a controversy, and here's why it isn't actually controversial. And they're like, of course this is behavior analytics. So I think if you're reading this and it's like a reply to the commentaries, you just have to know going into it that it is not entirely objective, right? Because it seems like they had an idea already on what they wanted to say.
And the commentaries themselves were also not objective.
Right, no. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, so here, their main purpose, I think, of writing this was to demonstrate how behavior analysis can make all of this controversy a little bit better by targeting this larger audience and helping define these problems that we have said that we're having, such as like operational definitions.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that they talk about here is that sometimes we might actually need to modify our designs when we're working with a larger population.
Right.
Right? And so they suggest, multiple baseline design across schools. We could do that, but it's probably going to be fairly weak when we're dealing with thousands of students. And I can't even tell you how many times at conferences and workshops that people are just saying behavior analysis has to get bigger. It has to talk about different areas and, we have to be more mainstream. Like this is a way that we could do it. And so they review 4 important lessons. The first lesson is that you have to use these evidence-based strategies and they have to be chosen by your stakeholders. So, right, like we talked about, it can't just be administration. It has to be everyone that's involved. You have to establish and implement systems that support implementation and buy-in of the program for as long as you're going to do it with high fidelity. So you're going to have to put systems in place to make sure that people are doing it and that people are happy about doing it. Otherwise, they're not going to do it when you're not there. Their third important lesson is the data collection systems must be easy enough so that all staff can and want to collect that meaningful data, which can be really hard.
I think at least in the initial stages, though, you would hopefully just be using the system that's already in place, which, while not ideal, just the ODR, the office referrals, is something that exists. It has to be taken. It's already part of the job. It's already a set expectation. And then as you start with that data, you can kind of iterate on the systems as you realize what needs to be implemented. What parts of the framework or what specifically in that framework needs to be implemented.
Yeah. And their fourth important lesson is implementation is key. So know it's not going to be quick, and know the phases and process of the implementation that you're going to have. And so some of the commentaries, the first commentary is, I'm going to do it my best, Jarmalowicz and Tetrot, 2015. They found that there may be some controversy around PBIS because of the data collection, because it's not direct observation, but rather these office referrals. And so this may be a misrepresentation of what's actually occurring, and they would want to see some direct observation. But the authors of this reply say this form may be tailored to more specific information with checkoffs. That could be a little bit easier, so they could get information about name, location, behavior, and those behaviors would be operationally defined on the sheet, the time of it occurred, and then they have this perceived function that a staff would write in. The perceived function of that behavior.
Yeah,
that one part
that
I was
makes me
like
a little nervous.
Me too, right? So I said possibly this might be helpful, but if you're not giving teachers training on what the function of the behavior is, that's going to be really hard to write in, right? And we all know that verbal report and actual function very rarely correlate. So you'd want to be kind of careful about that.
I tend to find, if I'm speaking to teachers of older students, it's often escape. If I'm speaking to teachers of younger students, it's often attention.
Oh.
But it might not be.
No.
Yeah.
In terms of what they're reporting.
Oh.
So
that's
the younger
actually
the student,
a good study.
The younger the student, the more I think the perception is they're doing it so that I pay attention to them. And the older the student, the more the perception they're doing it to get out of doing something.
Because their teachers are squares, man.
Another thing I was thinking about is if they're going to make teachers engage in more responding by doing these checkoffs, because it doesn't seem like they're doing that now, that they're going to have to do something with that data. So graphically display that data and use it to make decisions on the effectiveness of the program.
Yeah.
One thing I like that they did suggest is that they could use this data to suggest times and places where direct observation is warranted, and then maybe do a functional assessment in those specific areas. if there's a lot of behavior occurring. They said specifically, like, in the cafeteria, there may be a lot of yelling. So if you see a lot of office reports in the cafeteria for yelling, then that's a time when direct observation may be an important component where you can then go in and do a behavior assessment to verify the perceived function.
I think that's pretty, like, any behavior analyst worth their salt, when they're faced with a complex problem in a complex environment, will do something just like that. Okay, well, I can't get specific data on blank because I can't follow this child around for day after day after day. So you do your interview. And no one's going to be like, I did an interview, therefore I wrote the function. But you use that to inform what data should I collect from here. And then you keep kind of drilling down until you get the significant variable that you should be studying.
So I think that would be a really good extension in this PBIS literature, is talking about how they're looking at the sources of function for these problems behavior in tier 1, because that does seem very large and complex, and talk more about that in these conceptual or theoretical papers on how people might do that.
And we did not actually look in getting ready for the episode. We did not get any PBIS manuals.
No.
So there may be sections on what to do when your data is not telling you what you think it should tell you. We don't know. We just looked at the research.
Yeah. And so the authors also suggest that the data should be reviewed by the tier 1 team and then shared with everybody else, which makes sense, right, to keep promoting that buy-in. So these two authors commented that prevention science is sorely lacking in the field of ABA, and I would only slightly agree with them. So this is around the time that preschool life skills emerged. This was around the time where they started to teach delay and denial training, or FCTs. So I don't know if prevention science is sorely lacking in ABA. It may just not be well known to the mainstream public. They also highlight that if you're going to use this, you probably should use data from multiple sources and maybe not just that office referral. Because if you're just using that office referral, you're actually not taking data on any positive behaviors that you're seeking to increase. Wilson had a potential limitation of PBIS where she suggested that PBIS may not be culturally sensitive or have accurate data collection systems. She suggested that maybe because it's more of a top-down approach where administrators select behaviors, we're only looking at behaviors when they occur. Kids may only be part of the system when they engage in problem behavior. The data collection's only on problem behavior, and mental health issues are not addressed.
I understood the point and the concerns that Wilson had. They didn't strike me as perhaps the strongest reason to say that PBIS is courting controversy in the field, though. They were ones that should be discussed and addressed, but I don't know. They didn't grab me as like, yes, this is a serious problem with any of the other research I've read on PBIS.
Yeah, the authors of the commentary piece suggested that according to the primary authors of PBIS, Horner and Sugai, that all stakeholders should be at the table and have a voice, so that shouldn't be applicable. That should be culturally sensitive. And it's not a model, but a framework, so those should be addressed by the culture of the school. And it shouldn't rely on eligibility to special education, whereas what the author suggested is that now students are only getting services or only getting more embedded instruction and support when they're eligible for special education services. So this should actually benefit the entire population. And then with the data collection only on problem behavior, they were just like, basically that's not true. Yeah. But I could see where she's coming from there, because the focus primarily is on operationally defining those problem behaviors and the consequences, and not necessarily always focusing on those positive behaviors that you want to see.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the only like hard and fast dependent variable that they generally talk about. Right. And even that, it's once removed from actually observing the problem behavior. And, the other one that you reviewed, Rob, it was just a survey saying, do they seem to have more empathy or emotional regulation? So again, it's not being observed directly if we were to consider those to be the pro-social behaviors that were being taught. So like I get both sides of it. Like, you're trying to collect data on, let's say, 1,000 kids a day. You can't go in and observe 1,000 kids a day. You have to rely on some other method of getting your measurement system.
And when you're talking about the school-wide-ness of PBIS, a part of it is going to have to be, is that going to be good enough?
Mhm.
You don't need to get exact data on every single student. It just needs to be good enough that you are relatively confident that most of the students are engaging in appropriate emotional regulation and empathy, and they're not getting sent to the office. And then you get more specific with the students who you aren't seeing those same,
right. And it's just it's a balance, and it's a trade-off on, are we going to be okay enough with these data so that we can move on and get the job done, or are we going to get really bogged down? And Jackie, I know you're going to bring up Critchfield in a second, but I do worry that as behavior analysts, we're missing the forest for the trees. Sometimes when we have these opportunities to do bigger stakes, school-wide, society-wide interventions, by our short-sightedness in how precisely those data are going to be collected. And that's not to say that just secondary measurement and survey tools are okay, because I don't think they are. Right. But we have to figure out, like, what's going to be our threshold for okay. Maybe we do some sampling or something to meet our own criteria so that we can actually be beneficial.
Right. And this might be an area where we start big and we drill down. Like, a lot of the times when we're dealing with socially significant problem behavior, the research starts huge and then drills down to that, like, trying to figure out what's controlling the behavior, or how I can manipulate what's necessary or sufficient, right, with a component analysis or a parametric analysis. And I think Pbis may, in that way, we could do that with that, right? So if we're seeing people find success with it, we're seeing mainstream educational settings hold on to it, this is like a time for us to jump on board, right? Yeah. So the last 3 commentaries are all in full support of Pbis. Lukas in 2015 says we absolutely should be hanging out with other disciplines and getting others excited about behavior analysis. And Pbis can help us do that because they really need us, right? We're the ones that know about how to operationally define behaviors. We're the ones that know how to design systems and collect the data that you need to demonstrate that this is effective. And so Lukas says, like, come on, guys, let's get on board. You don't want to shy away from this one. This is your, like, train ticket to success.
Yeah, and the Putnam and Kincaid 2015 one also, they kind of reiterate that point of, they need us there, man. What are they going to do without us?
And Critchfield really rounds it up by saying, like, I can't believe, in not so many words, says, I can't believe that we haven't jumped on this, because obviously Skinner would be happy that Pbis exists. And he makes the point that nothing that Skinner came about with initially made anybody happy, that it always came, it came after it's been demonstrated to work over and over again with, like, personalized system and instruction, schedules of reinforcement, right? Nothing that Skinner ever created was initially, like, successful.
Yeah.
I love that point.
This is the closest that we've gotten to Skinner's, like, ideal of making a big societal change.
It's very true. So even though I did feel the bias toward Pbis in the commentary, I did find this article about commentaries fairly inspiring, right? Because they did it in a very professional and appropriate way. So they said, we agree with you, and here's how we would counteract that point, and here's how, how we would say, okay, yes, we may feel this is controversial, but here's how we would counteract it at the manual. The one thing that I've heard about Pbis, and I think, and I don't have any data to support this, so it's purely my own opinion, is that I've heard a lot of people say that, we use Pbis and not punishment.
Yeah.
So, right? So I think that's where I know that I have been fairly leery looking at Pbis, because obviously there is, in behavior analytic terms, punishment being used.
Yep.
Right? Because problem behavior is decreasing. Right? There are consequences.
Could be being extinguished.
Yeah, it could be being extinguished too. You're right. But there are consequences, right?
The fact that that's not a component of it. And that might speak to the idea of, we've got these systems. It's not like, Pbis is there and everyone's waiting for behavior analysis to jump in and help out. We know there's 16,000 plus schools in America.
How many schools are there in America?
More than 16,000. And I'm pretty sure that those schools didn't all wait to hire a behavior analyst to be on their PBIS team. I mean, how many of those schools, and some schools just districts hire 1 or 2 behavior analysts or BCBAs to be on their staff, so you cut that number down. But how many of those teams do you think have behavior analysts on them versus they just don't? They just didn't bother. They got someone who's got a background in behavior specialty or something like that.
Right.
But I'm guessing a lot of them.
I bet that if we popped a behavior analyst on board, that it might be very much more effective.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because, I mean,
maybe we'd actually know if it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Or, and we could make change based on that effectiveness.
Yeah. I was surprised when I hear about controversy around PBIS, I assumed it was, it's not ABA in the sense of it doesn't meet our 7 dimensions. And Anderson in the 2005 article does go into, here's how I think PBIS meets the definition of applied and behavioral and conceptual, technological, generality, effective. And I don't want to go into that list. She describes it way better than my notes are going to, and we're running a bit long. But that really didn't seem to be the concern. It was much more about the subjectiveness of the data, and then, again, concerns that I wouldn't have even thought of, the idea of it's not including the right stakeholders. It's not targeting mental health. So I was very surprised that it wasn't more, because I always thought the controversy was it doesn't count because it doesn't meet our definition of applied behavior analysis. And maybe it is for some folks, but that doesn't seem to be the controversy it courted.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the concern for me is that I didn't think it was function-based, right? And the Tier 1 model isn't really looking at function, but that's why you have the Tier 2 and Tier 3, right? Like, that's when you bring in someone to determine the function of this problem behavior that's continuing in the face of PBIS.
Of added reinforcers,
right? And then you make an individualized plan to address it. So when you think, I had not learned about Tier 2 and Tier 3 before in this context, so once I added those in, I felt more comfortable with the idea that it could become a function-based treatment.
So let's move into dissemination station and kind of go over some of the big points. So I think we've hit on this point a whole bunch, but just to bring it up again, when we're talking about positive behavior intervention and supports, we're talking about a framework that has key components. However, for many of us, that might be why when you say, I don't really understand what PBIS is, it's because you're not talking about specific systems that are going to be used every single time. You're talking about that framework. So there are pieces that need to be in place, but the specific interventions are going to vary a lot, which, pros would be that it could allow for more generality, that it could take more into account the needs of the stakeholders, making it more culturally competent practice. And then the cons being that, there's not a manual for this is how PBIS will look in your school, which could make it a little bit harder to implement and does actually require those steps that I think a lot of people hate doing in terms of having a team, reviewing data regularly. Everyone would love to skip those steps and just do something and then be told this is totally going to work because the research says so. You can't really do that if you're using a PBIS framework because you don't have a system that you're always going to use. Like, you don't always use the same type of reinforcement programming. It's going to be different. You may or may not use punishment. And not just because you just want to say I don't use punishment because it makes you feel like a bad person. You may actually not use punishment procedures.
That's true.
You may use a lot of punishment procedures. And that may be okay for the population you're working with. Or the problems you're working with.
Yeah. Depends on if you've moved through all the appropriate, less restrictive alternatives first.
Yeah. The framework of the Tier 1 and 2 and 3, I think we're all kind of getting more and more on board with that as a system that we should all really be practicing if we want to continue to grow the scope of behavior analysis. So I think we're kind of all on board with the idea of the tiered model. If we're going to be doing scaling up, it's not going to look the same as their individual interventions. There's going to be a little bit more subjective data collected, which we don't have to love. We just have to accept that might be something that is occurring, in which case we can just say, well, what can we do to make that even better than it used to be? It also gives us a sense of, here's how we can increase the dosage of our interventions, but some of the research regarding what those Tier 2 interventions look like is still a little vague, and many of our studies that we saw to tell us how effective PBIS is don't include a lot of detail as to what Tier 2 interventions were in place. And I think, the other big take-home point is that if you say, I love this idea of PBIS, I'm going to buy the PBIS manual by Horner and Sugai, I'm going to read it all, and then I'm going to implement it tomorrow, guess what? You're not. You're
Yeah.
not going to do that. You can buy the manual, you can read the manual, but if you don't have anyone else who wants to help you implement PBIS on a large scale, you're really just looking at systems of individual intervention again,
Right.
but not even good systems of individual
Right.
intervention because most of the PBIS is focused on that universal level.
Right. So I think it might be helpful too to, if this is something you want to do, get that team like we talked about, and then write down like your timeline, right? So we're going to have this created by then, this created by then, and then have like maybe a review team to also review to make sure it makes sense.
Yeah.
Right. And make sure that the reinforcement systems that you've added in are appropriate for your population.
Mhm.
Like if someone said, oh, we'll call out this high school student, right? We all were like, oh, that would be the worst. So making sure that,
Horrifying.
yeah, making sure that you're in touch, because if the reinforcement's not effective,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, and if this is in place in 20,000 schools, then maybe there's one near you that's already
Yeah.
doing it, and you can
Yeah.
reach out to them to
That's
help
great.
figure out how to get started.
Yeah, that would tell you exactly what to do necessarily because the framework's going to be the same, but the systems might not be.
Right.
There actually were, Diana, speaking of that, there was a talk by Bob Putnam at Mass Abba in 2012. So I had some notes from that or some handouts. And he did go over 7 states that were scaling up PBIS and their results and sort of the summary of some of their results. Like, what are the key things you need? And the pieces that seemed to allow for PBIS to have the best results from, at least in those areas, were the administrative leadership on board to give them funding support, as well as just all the other support that comes into making any big level, high level change. A lot of training so that you could build capacity. That included local training, it included coaching. Behavioral expertise did seem to be a factor that was helpful in implementing effective PBIS systems. And then he also talked about the idea of starting with little demonstrations of how PBIS could be useful to document them, to kind of get more people involved. What I didn't have in my notes, and this was from a talk 7 years ago, was what a demonstration actually meant, because it seemed like very small scale compared to what PBIS would look like, so I'm not sure what that exactly meant. But the idea of building support over time by showing some success.
Maybe one classroom.
Yeah, maybe looking at classrooms. Yeah, looking at little classroom changes. And then, of course, the ongoing evaluation data. So having fidelity data, are the systems that we think we're putting in place actually in place? And then looking at outcome data so that you continually improve the system. That's the other thing. PBIS seems to be more like the living organism treatment than use this treatment and get these results. If you're not taking your data and then changing your system based on the needs of your population, it's only going to get you so far. Well, guys, we talked a lot about PBIS, and I think we didn't actually talk about that much at all.
No. No and yes.
Covered a lot of ground, Rob.
We did cover a lot of ground. We tried to get it all in there, but again, we knew we weren't going to fit it all in there. And maybe this is a topic we should come back to at some point. That brings us to the end of the episode. Before we go, I want to make sure everyone hears that second secret code word, and it is Tootsie. Tootsie. Tootsie, like your toes, or a Tootsie Roll. Or that great 1980 film with Dustin Hoffman where he pretends to be a woman. It's really good. Really good.
Oh, it's a great movie.
Really great movie. Tootsie.
I haven't seen it.
It's really good. Did you see it?
It's really good.
I don't know how it holds up.
You know, I saw it not that long ago, and I want to say it's aged okay, but there's probably some inappropriate jokes.
I mean, I think the last time I saw it would have been like early 2000s, and I feel like there have been a lot of social and cultural changes since then that I'm much more aware
I
of.
love Dustin Hoffman. It's
He's
still okay
great.
to say that, right?
I think
Still
so.
on the good list.
I think so.
I love
Yeah,
Dustin
Jessica
Hoffman.
Lange, young Jessica Lange.
Yeah.
Really, really good.
Yeah.
All right, that brings us to the end of the show. 'Cause we know it's the end of the show because we started talking about movies and not about PBIS anymore. We hope you enjoyed ABA Inside Track. If you did, please think about subscribing to our show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you like to get your podcasts. We'd also really appreciate it if you left us a review. There are a couple ways to do that. One is by leaving it on your favorite podcast service. Another is by going to find us on social media and just reaching out and chatting with us. We're on Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, and Instagram as ABA Inside Track. You can also leave comments on our website, abainsidetrack.com, or on our YouTube page, where we have these episodes posted with the YouTube subtitling features. And of course, always feel free to reach out with comments, thoughts, topic suggestions to abainsidetrack@gmail.com. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!